Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has just completed a three-nation tour, the highlight of which was the final decision to acquire 36 Rafale fighters from France.
Despite extensive trials and 3 years of negotiations to add Rafale fighters to the Indian Air Force inventory, concerns were being expressed about the Air Force's ability to effectively defend India in the event of another war due to delays in acquisition of the Rafale. So when Prime Minister Modi began his recent three-nation tour, all eyes were on how India would finally close the Rafale deal with France. So the Prime Minister's decision to buy 36 Rafale fighters in flyaway condition was welcomed by the Air Force, though the government's desire for them to be made in India was shelved for the moment. But this has given hope to other countries such as Germany to re-enter the fray in the hope of getting a slice of India's big defense pie. But critics believe India's large inventory doesn't reflect any consistency in its defense doctrine. The challenge, however, for the Modi government is to cut down India's defense import bills while still ensuring the efficacy of India's forces.
In most of Mr. Modi's arrangements with the big powers, the one element that is emerging as clearly the dominating theme is the defense purchases and the defense deals that this government has undertaken, some of it as a follow-up of the arrangements and initiatives put together by the last government. To discuss how much defense deals mean for India's diplomatic initiatives, we have with us Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who's been our envoy to France in 2011-2013 and was the man who actually finally sealed the Rafale deal. And we have Air Chief Marshal Krishnaswamy, who was Air Chief from 2002 to 2004, and amongst other things is an aviation expert who has laid out the guidelines for the LCA project. Ambassador Sood, you sealed the Rafale deal. What went wrong with it, and why did it need the special intervention by the Prime Minister now to pick up 36 aircrafts?
Well, I don't think the deal was sealed in 2011. In fact, the deal preceded. In fact, the RFP was put out in 2007. The first interest by the Air Force was even earlier, at the turn of the century, around 2000, 2001. So the deal has been in the making for quite a long time. What happened was that the technical evaluation and then finally the financial bids were opened in 2012. And at that time, it was decided that Rafale was the L1 or the lowest bidder. And we started negotiations with Dassault during the period that I was ambassador in France.
Clearly, as the ambassador is bringing out, that there's a lot of legwork that goes into these deals. But in many ways, at least in the Rafale deal, it was becoming evident that the Air Force and successive air chiefs have made remarks to the press to say that our capability to handle our security commitments is being depleted to the extent that we may not be able to deliver on the nation's expectations. Is that true?
I'll first come to a very specific point. Personally, I think it is a brilliant move that the government, a decision that this government has taken of all the speculations to come to a stop and then take a positive decision of what possibly the country needs in terms of the plannings that have been made for defense. And rightly, as you said, that it is just not overnight so-called thought process that Rafale must come. It possibly started in my time or even before that, that's somewhere in 2000. The issue was that there was a depletion and we needed to fill those up with appropriate modernization program, and that's how the LCA came into being. LCA, we started off as a thought process in 1987 or so. And the realistically speaking, the time, so-called the time and so-called achieve those performances within the time and cost frame was somewhat unreal. And because of, but we had to pursue with that program because that government, that is supported by the government and funded by the government, rightly so. And because of that, we waited for the so-called LCA, and that target kept getting, postponed year after year, and it is taken finally about 30 odd years. But I'm not commenting any adversely on the program as such. But in the meanwhile, the Air Force had to so-called keep on buying in bits and pieces as additional aeroplanes. For
No,
example,
I want to come to that point, Ambassador Sood. Two quick questions here. One is, it has often been said that India's purchases from various countries reflect somewhat of a collection of an ad hoc arsenal. There's a book also authored by a British writer on the subject. And equally important, what also reflects is that there is an Indian desire to please all in the big players in the international community by buying a bit from here and a bit from there. I mean, Apache helicopters from the US, fighter aircraft from the French, and with the French deal now being reconsidered, the Germans are likely to trying to push the Eurofighter once again back onto the Indian table. In all this, do you feel that the defense relationship and the defense related transactions very much dominate your work as an ambassador and as an Indian envoy in some of these key countries?
Well, I would say not just the defense, but I would include the strategic sectors, namely the nuclear sector, space sector, and defense sector. And I think that in our relationship with major powers, whether it is the United States, whether it is France, whether it is Russia, these are the sectors that actually dominate the relationship. These are also sensitive sectors. By and large, even where the industry is in the private sector, the export licensing means that the control of transfer of technology and so on is with the government in these countries.
Air Chief Marshal, going back to the fighter aircraft deals, but at the same time, the last government has done more or less the same thing that the Modi government has now done because timelines needed to be met. It is said that the Air Force seriously needs a fresh stock of aircrafts by 2017. There is a long experience of Dassault operating aircrafts in India, the company that makes the Rafale. You have Mirages, you have other French arrangements that have been in place. So could you fault this move by the Prime Minister? And likewise, could we then say that the UPA2 government was also doing the same thing? So what's so great about what this government is?
The government seemed to be giving a certain drive towards acquiring from certain countries to improve their so-called diplomatic leverage or whatever. I have been in an acquisition program for about 10 years, and then I did 3 years as the chief. Never once I had ever got ever note or file or information or direction from the government in our democracy to say, please look for so-and-so machine or from so-and-so country. Never. I must say with a lot of respect and admiration to the government, or whether it's UP or ND is not the point, but it is always left to the so-called defense and the so-called acquisition process to say, guys, now you go and look at something appropriate, and we raise so-called files and cases which we are generally very familiar. When it reaches to some kind of a fructification, that's the time certain discussions take place with the government.
A quick answer to a question. What was the tipping point in favor of the Rafale aircraft as against the others that were in contention? I mean, what was the message that came to you from Delhi after, rightly so, the services went through very, very extensive trials? It said, the one counter-argument against this aircraft was that it wasn't so battle-tested as many of the other variants. Its only real battlefield experience was in Libya.
No, it has also been used in Afghanistan. It is currently being used in the operations against the IS, and of course it had the Libyan experience behind it. But I think the testing of the aircraft in terms of its technical capabilities was something which was done by the Air Force. And after that, the financial bids See, first of all, because of the fact that we hadn't undertaken any major purchases, this was a very large deal, number one. Number two, new methods in terms of evaluating life cycle costs and so on were brought into this particular negotiation, which is what led to a certain amount of complexity in the negotiation. To add to that was also the demands with regard to significant transfer of technology. By the time the last of the aircraft was going to roll out, it would have had 80% indigenous content. So in that sense, it was very much, the idea was to develop domestic aerospace capabilities, and which is why the negotiations took a certain length of time.
Welcome back. One of the points that is emerging in our discussion on diplomacy and defense deals is the fact that whether the deal with the French government for the Rafale aircrafts or any other previous deals, they form part of a larger strategic umbrella in which India conducts its relations with the key powers in the world. Air Chief Marshal, sir, it is said that the French aircraft, and the critics to that said that it wasn't sufficiently battle tested, but as Ambassador Sood has brought out, that wasn't just tested in Libya, but in Afghanistan and against the ISIS now in the Arab world. But what about the contenders? Did they have a better battlefield record? And more importantly, which of the other contenders, if we had gone in for, would have allowed us to use them to further our Make in India efforts? Because the Make in India initiative, up to now, as I understand, with the MiGs, the Sukhois, and a whole lot of other aircraft, has largely been related to and left for us to assemble the not so sensational part of the equipment, the strategic aspects and the strategic technology and weapon systems. The control is kept by Russians or whoever else.
The contenders were, the others were Eurofighters, which had never been battle tested. In fact, it was even more new than the Gripen itself. The MiG-35 is actually still a prototype. It was never been in operation anywhere. And the F-18, of course, it's a very old variant that had been flying. But what is being offered to us is totally a new aeroplane, which has never flown. I mean, it's never been in operational service. In fact, among the lot, only the so-called, my understanding is, the only one which is actually ahead of the rest in operational field was the Rafale. Having said that, all these are of a generation which is of so-called the latest, and they use some very, very advanced technology. Not necessarily all of them have common technology. Each one. Technology is something to do with the processes and tools, and it's an outcome of research and development. Each country follows its own footsteps. Therefore, all these five have different technology. What exactly would suit us is a matter of big question mark, is about what exactly our goals are. Now, coming to this point, we have a severe limitation of infrastructure and skill sets. Now, we have produced 500 MiG-21s under license. We have produced about 200 Jaguars. We have produced hundreds of other aeroplanes under license. We have producing the Hawk, at least 75 of them under license. Are they really taking us to anywhere into the so-called indigenous capability? We should look back and say they don't.
Ambassador Sood, sir, I want to move away from the debate just on aircraft to the larger strategic issues. Look at India's continuing relationship with Russia. Look at its relationship now as it is evolving with the Americans. 2-3 points stick out. Russia still provides more or less 70% of our military inventory. The Americans in the last 2 years have become India's largest defense supplier, again through the government-to-government route, and they've got contracts in excess of $10 billion. But both countries are also talking to us in terms of other strategic issues. Russia is talking of 12 nuclear reactors and maybe more thereafter. Russia is also talking of military-to-military training, which has been happening with Russia, the United States, elsewhere. The Americans, even Obama has been on record to say that it sees India, and he sees India as the strategic partner of the United States in the 21st century. So therefore, as a diplomat, Do you once again contest this view that India's relationship with the big powers is based on largely leveraging with defense deals, or is there a bigger strategic plot that we are playing to?
I think there is a bigger strategic plot. And the bigger strategic plot, in my view, is the geopolitical shift from the Euro-Atlantic to what I call the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. Now, as economic power shifts, as geopolitical center of gravity shifts, India obviously becomes that much more important, particularly if India can sustain its growth rate. After all, our foreign trade today is nearly 40% of our GDP, and that is what gives us heft and weight in the international community. And in the next 10 years, we expect our foreign trade to go up to nearly 70% of our GDP. That is a significant weight. So these are the changes that are happening. With that, we also must remember that during the Cold War period, Western sources, particularly US sources, were blocked. We did not buy equipment from the United States because we did not get export licenses. It is only now that we have started purchasing equipment from the United States, and even then, transfer of technology, we still have to explore where we get into transfer of technology. It is only in recent years that we started what is called the Defense Technology Initiative, which Deputy Secretary Ashton Carter, who's now the Defense Secretary, US Defense Secretary, he started that, but we are still exploring projects in it. The nuclear issue was a major achievement, but there it was with the previous government and President George Bush when they decided that India and US would cooperate in civilian nuclear cooperation.
We have decided now to go in for pathfinder projects with the Americans, which includes mini Raven UAVs. We are looking at roll-on, roll-off kits for C-130s, mobile electric, various arrangement for aircraft carrier, and at the same time, we are looking at advancing that into more bigger projects at some stage. Now, here is the story of our defense acquisition process, of which you've been a part of, and the establishment. But on the other side, where strategic embargoes have been placed on India, like missiles, we produce world-class stuff. So how would you sum up our inability to do more with defense technology as against strategic weapon systems?
I think we are gone too much into putting into the diplomatic and these compulsions. But actually, when we look at it, there are only 4 countries in the world which produce jet engines. There are only 5 countries now we are talking about. The main supplier of systems are US, Europe, Russia. That's it. Now, one we have not touched upon is Israel. It's a huge supplier today. We missed that out. So in other words, system, subsystem, weapon system, etc., Israel is emerging as very, very important supplier. Then you have the primary system is America, Europe, and Russia. My opinion is licensed manufacture is no indigenization. We have to look at generating totally an indigenous design, like the helicopters, like the LCA, now like the trainers. We have to go back to them. We should start developing this all in our stable.
Does the deal with Dassault for the Rafale aircraft and all the delays that happened with it, and then finally India going and picking up 36, which it could have done 3 years ago, does it show us in poor light?
Well, the 36 for which the decision has been made, that I do not think contributes to Make in India. However, what the defense minister has said is that we don't yet know what steps the government will take, because 36 is not a substitute for the original deal of 126. And mind you, the original deal of 126 had also an extra option of an additional 63. So 36 cannot be a substitute for either 126 or 189 potentially. Now, how we deal with the balance requirement, what kind of combination, that is what can contribute to Make in India, provided we have a defense procurement policy which is geared to that, provided our offsets are imaginatively handled, and provided the decisions are taken quickly.
Right. To sum up, we can say quite confidently that there are a lot of issues that have emerged in this discussion, but clearly it is the strategic issues in a relationship that New Delhi has with major big powers that is more important than just defense deals, which in strategic issues you could link in the nuclear aspects, the transfer of various other high-end technologies, and of course the relationship where the focus of attention of the world, having shifted from Europe to Asia Pacific, India is seen as a partner by many big powers. The second thing is there is no pressure that really comes to bear on the armed forces by either the civilian politicians or the bureaucracy for a particular weapon systems to be purchased from a particular country to further diplomatic initiatives, but the services are left to make the best choice in national interest. There is also a geopolitical shift that is taking place, and some small countries which do not bag the headlines like the big deals with France and the United States often have, such as Israel, are continuing to rise up the ladder as India's big defense providers. And finally, if Mr. Modi and his government wish to proceed further and further with the Make in India initiative, then it is not about assembling technologies and weapon systems in India, which we've done for the last 6 decades or more, but more importantly to design and manufacture and make them worthy of the expectations of our armed forces. Thank you very much, sir, for what was indeed an enlightening discussion. We'll be back next week with another episode of Latitude. Until then, goodbye and thank you.